So, respected guests, honored faculty, dear students, and cherished members of Voices from the Periphery. It is with profound respect and heartfelt delight that we gather today to welcome a scholar whose work has not only advanced the field of oral history, but has also deepened our understanding of what it means to listen, to remember, and to narrate. We are deeply honored to receive Professor Alexander Freund. Professor Freund holds the chair in German Canadian Studies and is co director of the Oral History Center at the University of Winnipeg, where he has built a remarkable place for critical reflection on memory and testimony. His scholarship moves across themes of migration, memory, and identity, always asking us to consider the intimate ways in which ordinary lives become part of the historical record. Through his influential works, such as Oral History and Ethnic History, Beyond the Nation, Immigrants, Local Lives in Transnational Cultures, and Oral History and Photography, Professor Freund has consistently challenged us to see oral history not as a transparent window onto the past, but as a complex negotiation between narrators, listeners, and the larger structures of power in which both are embedded. His writings are a reminder that history is not only written in archives but also spoken in kitchens, whispered across borders, and remembered in the silences between words. Today's lecture, Confessing Animals, a discussion about oral history's complicated history, takes us to the very heart of these questions. Drawing inspiration from my Michel Foucault's provocative insight that modern individuals have become confessing animals, Professor Freund argues us to think critically about the ways in which oral history has sometimes reproduced rather than resisted dynamics of confession, surveillance, and authority. What does it mean to ask someone to tell their story? Who has the power to ask, to listen, to record? And how do we as historians avoid the trap of turning living voices into mere evidence? These are not only methodological concerns, they are ethical responsibilities. What distinguishes Professor Freund's scholarship is the humility and ethical attentiveness with which he approaches narrators. He reminds us that to listen is never a passive act, it is always a charged encounter, one that requires care, responsibility, and self reflection. In this, his work resonates deeply with the spirit of voices from the periphery, to listen to what has been silenced, to question the authority of dominant narratives, and to remain mindful of the politics of remembering. On behalf of all of us, I extend our warmest welcome and deepest gratitude to Professor Alexander Freund. We are privileged to learn from your insights today, and we look forward to the ways your lecture will inspire us to listen differently, to think critically, and to write histories that are more honest, more inclusive, and more human. Up to you, sir.
Great. Thank you very much, Palab. And thank you to you and the Voices from the Periphery for inviting me to talk about a topic that I continue to cherish and pursue in different ways. Um, Maybe you can put up the PowerPoint that I sent you, and then we can look at the photographs that I wanted to share with all of you. Palab, can you put up the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir, I can try. Just
Okay,
wait a minute.
thanks.
Just 1 minute. I don't know, sir. Can you see? Am I? Is the screen is
Yeah,
visible?
there we go.
Okay, so I present this. Okay, sir.
Great. Okay. So, so I wanted to start my lecture or my discussion with looking at this image on the poster for this event. And I did not choose that image. I did not choose that photograph. And Palab, can I put you on the spot? Can you just tell us briefly, why did you choose this particular image for our discussion?
Actually, sir, my friend Ayush, he suggested me this image, so he will join soon, and we will continue this question. So,
So did you choose the image?
no, he basically he choose this image for
Okay.
maybe I think that's maybe the World War trauma. I think he for that
Yes.
he can elaborate this. I think better. So.
Is he already present?
No. I was just will join sometimes later. He is on the meet of the University of Sussex. I told you.
Okay.
Okay.
So then we can ask him later. We can push that
Oh,
question to the back.
okay, sir.
So
Thank you.
because I wanted to look at this photograph in more detail. Um, and so my first response to the image was that I found it difficult to figure out how this corresponded to the topic of our discussion. Um, so the question that I had was, how does an image of a soldier in a trench relate to the topic of confession or oral history, or specifically oral history as a form of confession? I was a bit thrown off, and then I thought about images that I thought would have been a better fit. And I came up with several images because because of this article that I had published many years ago about oral history and confession. I had thought about different forms of confession. And so here I just wanted to give you some standard scenes of confession that come to my mind. One is a medical doctor conducting an anamnesis, so asking a patient about his history of illness. Of course, the most obvious example is a priest taking confession in a confession booth in a Catholic church, but also a therapist, especially a psychoanalyst, silently conversing with a patient in order to get to some deep-seated and perhaps even unconscious root cause of illnesses.
Hello.
Another image that came to my mind was a police
Hello.
officer.
Sir,
Hello?
am I audible? Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. So, sorry, sir. My name is Ayush. Pallav just asked me why we just choose the image. That's why I just joined, because I have
Yes.
another meeting. So
Okay, hang on a sec. I want to just finish this part and then I'll ask you, okay?
Okay, okay, sir.
Okay, great. So another image that I thought of was a police officer interrogating a subject or a suspect, or a judge, a prosecutor, a lawyer interrogating witnesses. But I also thought about more recent ideas. Perhaps an image of a guest on an afternoon talk show like Dr. Phil's, or a celebrity confession on Oprah Winfrey's show that was popular in the 1990s, making some sort of a public confession. But when I thought about, this idea of confessing, I also thought about a father or a mother picking up their kids from school and asking them, "What did you do today?" So this, asking questions. So my mental image of confession is of an interrogator questioning an interrogatee, someone from whom a truth needs to be extracted using whatever method and means are deemed necessary. So yes, Ayush, if you want to tell us why you chose this image.
Thank you, sir, for this chance. I was thinking that when I was choosing this picture, the background, if you see that the background is a historic war photograph, it's World War II. I was thinking that there is a trench, suggests that produced countless oral testimonies, right? Soldiers telling the stories of survival, trauma, comradeship, and there's a soldier who is smiling. I was thinking that why smile in such a place? This reveals, the complexity of oral history. Human memory is not like kind of straightforward. People remember joy and pain in tangled ways. So the phrase "confessing animals," I was thinking about postmodern thinker Foucault, suggests that humans are compelled to speak. To narrate themselves even under, such circumstances. So soldiers in trenches were often pushed into confessing their inner fears, dreams, trauma, sometimes to comrades, sometimes much later to interviewers. So that's why I chose this picture for this, because the soldier is both, what I can say, humanized by his smile and animalized by the, what I can say, the trench war setting, reduced to a body in mud and survival. So that's why I chose this
Great.
picture.
That's very thoughtful. And I want to come back to that a little bit later. And I wanted to choose this image to sort of, think about how we usually think of confession. And you've already mentioned Michel Foucault. So to me, confession always boils down to this idea of extracting a truth that someone who's being questioned, an interrogatee, is unable or unwilling to give up, right? So in psychoanalysis or therapy, usually a patient is unable to come to a knowledge about oneself without any help. And of course, in a police officer questioning a suspect, they are more likely to be unwilling to give up this kind of information. So you mentioned Foucault, and of course, this idea of extracting truth through confession is not my idea. I have it from the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault, and especially from his first volume of the History of Sexuality, The Will to Knowledge, where Foucault has a short section on confession. And there Foucault argues that confession was a core practice of Catholic Christianity from very early on and became institutionalized in the 13th century. And Foucault also argues that it was later extended, this idea of confession, to medicine and the law, and especially to psychoanalysis. Now, for Foucault, the topic of confession was always sexuality, but the goal was to extract a truth. And it was a very particular truth that Foucault was interested in. It was the truth about oneself. And so the main point that Foucault makes is that the search for the truth about oneself did not lead to finding the truth about oneself, to find one's true inner self. Instead, the social practice of looking for the truth about oneself was shaped by the prompts and the sanctions from priests and judges and doctors and therapists. And as such, this practice did not result in finding the truth about oneself. Instead, it resulted in a social construction of a truth about the self. And of course, it was not just the person, the individual, the confessant, so to speak, who constructed this truth. It was the confessor, the person taking the confession as well, the priest, the doctor, the therapist, and as I will also argue, the oral historian. So when I talk about the social construction of the self, I'm mostly interested in the idea that our self is not autonomous. So the stories we tell about ourselves and our lives are not autonomous, but instead refer back to culture and society, using cultural scripts, social meanings, and values to create an image in the moment of the telling that is directed at a specific audience for a specific purpose, and that is constrained not just by limits of memory, something we often deal with in oral history, but also by narrative conventions, social sanctions about what is sayable, and peer pressures to perform in certain ways, but not in others. There's another important point that Foucault makes. It took the church many centuries to get people to confess, to attend confession. First, it was only a sort of a once-in-a-lifetime event, usually on the deathbed. Then it became an annual event, and finally it became much more frequent. Having to go to confession frequently and from early childhood on meant that people learned to monitor themselves, to monitor their own behavior, so they could confess to sins they had committed over the previous month or week. But what was initially imposed externally and with great pressure and even force, by the late 19th century at the latest had become a voluntary act. In psychoanalysis, the confessee or the patient initiates the exchange with the hope of becoming healthy. And Foucault speaks here of a ruse, of a trap. And that ruse is that by now we believe that attending to our inner self, examining in detail any aberration, and looking to a professional in search of fixing the self is not an act of oppression, but an act of freedom, of self-fulfillment, of self-care, and that it has become pleasurable to confess. So in my article, Confessing Animals Toward a Longue Durée History of the Oral History Interview, which I published in the American journal Oral History Review in 2014, I connected the history of confession as outlined by Foucault to the history of oral history. And my main point was that oral history was very much shaped by similar ideas of finding truth about the self of the interviewee, not the interviewer. And furthermore, that oral history contributed to the social construction of the self. And finally, I argued that oral history continues to be motivated by finding a true self, rather than acknowledging that it participates in the construction of a self in a way that was similar to other confessional practices. So none of this is new, none of this is my original thinking. When I think about these ideas of how constrained we are in talking or telling our lives, I'm often thinking of Plato's allegory of the cave, and I'm thinking of Karl Marx's famous phrase, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." And so it is when we tell stories about ourselves. We tell our own stories, but we do not tell them as we please, but under the circumstances provided by the past. And confessional practices are one such social circumstance that confines how we can tell our stories. So as I say, when I looked at the photograph of the soldier in the trenches, I couldn't figure out the connection between the photograph and the whole topic of confessional practices. But then I looked again at this photograph and I thought, yes, this image really does speak to the theme we want to talk about today. Now, here's the problem. The connection to confession and oral history is not obvious at first. And it is not obvious because we cannot see the interrogator. We cannot see the person taking confession. We can only see the witness, the person giving the confession. So we can only see the interrogatee, the witness who is being questioned. And who is this witness? In the image we have on the poster, he is an anonymous soldier, most likely in a trench somewhere in Europe during the First World War. I did a bit of archival digging, and what I found was that it depicted a soldier from the 25th Canadian Infantry Battalion, and his name was Robert Lindsay Rogers. So this person that we are looking at was Robert Lindsay Rogers of the 25th Canadian Infantry Battalion. Who is the interrogator? And there are two answers to that, at least two answers. The first answer is that it is the photographer. The aim of the photographer was to extract a truth from the witness, the soldier, in order to extract a greater truth about something larger, in this case, war and the social and human costs of war. Unlike the various confessional practices I noted above, however, this is not a narrative confession, it is a visual confession. It is a bodily confession and an almost involuntary revelation. The camera frame and the trench act as a confessional booth. What is confessed is not clear. Is it survival? Is it resilience? Is it masculinity? Is it a denial of trauma? I want to turn away from the witness for now and then to the photographer. So who was the photographer? And again, we find answers in the Canadian National Archives, the Library and Archives Canada. And they tell us that it was William Ivor Castle, a lieutenant in the Canadian Armed Forces and one of three official photographers for the Canadian military during the First World War. And I want us to take a closer look at the original photographs. So Palab, if you can just move to the next slide. Yes. So this is the original photograph. And I'll give you the title of the image. And it's not clear who titled the image that way, but this is the title that the Library and Archives Canada has given the image. It's called Dressing Wounded in Trench During the Battle of Courcelette, September 15th, 1916. And now we see Robert Lindsay Rogers at the bottom left corner, crouching down. We also see the soldier taking care of him. And we see 6 other soldiers to the right of them. We see also various kinds of materials and equipment. And 2 of the soldiers, so Robert Lindsay Rogers and another one on the right-hand side, look directly into the camera. Now, did the photographer call out so they would look to him? Or was it a coincidence that both looked up at the same time? We don't know. The Battle of Courcelette in September 1916 was part of the battles of the Somme, and it was the first battle in which Canadian troops participated. Also present at the scene of fighting. And Palab, you can show the next image now. Palab, can you show the next image? Ah, there we go. So here's an image that he took showing, according to the title provided by the Canadian Archives, a Canadian heavy howitzer in action during the Battle of Courcelette in September 1916. And then we have another image, if you can show that. Yes. So this one he also took during the battle, titled Horse Ambulance Picking Up Wounded at Advanced Dressing Station. Close up behind front during the Great Battle, September 15th, 1916. And then I want to show one more image. If you can show us the next one. So now this one, we move back into the trench, back from the battlefield, from the front lines. And this photograph is titled First Aid Being Rendered to Wounded at Courcelette, September 1916. And so you may see that it shows the same scene as in the original first photograph, but from a different angle. The photographer has moved to his left. He's now standing above the trench, possibly on some sort of a little bridge. He's once again looking down on the scene. And the same soldier is looking straight into the camera. He's sort of top center there. He's standing at the top center of the image. He's still looking at the camera. He's directly into the camera. He's not attending to the wounded soldier anymore. And even though he's the most prominent character in both images, he's sort of the center of the scene, the archive provides no information about this soldier, so we don't know who he was. On the bottom, we see Robert Lindsay Rogers. He's still crouching. He's not smiling. And he's instead looking into the face of one of the two soldiers caring for him. Now there's also a second soldier taking care of him. And so I think that this image was taken shortly after the first image that we saw. I don't know what the numbers at the bottom of the photographs mean, but if they indicate chronological sequence, they suggest that the first image we saw was taken first. It was 0.736, and then the one we are looking at now is 0.756. So I want to briefly wrap up this investigation into this particular photographic war scene. Here's a final image showing the photographer in action. So Palabi, you can just advance to the next. Yes. So the image is titled Canadian Official Photographer with Artillery Watching a Battle on the Western Front, September 1916. So this is the Battle of Courcelette. It shows photographer William Ivor Castle at right. So he's the one to the very right there. We can only see him from the back. With a Canadian War Records Office cinematographer. So that's the person who's standing right in the center there. Oscar Bovell, and other officers recording the bombardment of German positions during the Battle of Courcelette. Bovell, with tripod, seems to be operating a Moy and Basti Cine camera and maybe taking film related to his Canadian Victory at Courcelette movie, while Castle, the photographer, is likely holding a Goertz camera. So that is part of the archival description. Castle died shortly after the Second World War, and later, so in 1947, and later it became clear that he had staged and retouched and otherwise manipulated several of his images that became famous or infamous. The photographs I have shown you, however, have not been identified as having been staged or manipulated. Robert Lindsay Rogers, the soldier, was killed in action in Flers-Courcelette 9 months after the photographs were taken in August 1917. So let us get back to the image we saw on the poster, in detail from the image dressing wounded. Yes, thank you. Focus on Robert Lindsay Rogers. And let us get back to this question, who is the interrogator? We said that it was the photographer, but another interrogator is not the photographer, but us. We are also interrogators, the viewers. What we do with images, how we look at them, is part of a confessional practice where we seek to extract a truth. So I think the person who chose the image, I think he has left, but I think what he probably saw in the photograph was also in the detail of the photograph was also as some sort of a greater truth. And there is a greater truth, but with all historical sources, we need to apply methods and theories of interpretation in order to come to plausible and convincing answers to what this truth may be. So if we look at the soldier's expression, and especially his eyes, we ask, what do they say? What do these eyes say? Some people have suggested that he was delirious or shell-shocked. And in fact, the close-up, this particular image of the soldier circulates widely online with the heading, "The Shell-Shocked Soldier." So if you search online for the shell-shocked soldier, you will get a lot of images that are of this particular scene. There's no evidence for this diagnosis. There's no evidence to show that he was indeed shell-shocked. And there have been other interpretations. Others have suggested that he was smiling and happy because he had just been told that his wounding would be his ticket home. As we know today, that was not the case, but he may have believed it at the time. So, as in oral history and any other confessional practice, next to possible truths, there are also silences and things that we cannot know in photography. But either way, whether he was delirious or happy or whatever else these eyes tell us, it is the eyes that draw us into the scene and that unsettle us at the same time, because they seem to provide insight into a deeper truth that is difficult, if not impossible, to put into words. We have been told that eyes are windows into the soul. We are looking into these eyes because we want to find something in them. But as we are seeking, we are constructing meanings. And this is what we do as oral historians as well. We document people's stories, hoping they provide windows into their souls. And as with this photograph, we are never content to leave it at that. Instead, we then go on to interpret, to construct meanings about the idea that the self is stable, fixed, and a container of deeper truths. So the question of confession and oral history directly confronts us with the epistemology and methodology of this interpretive act. What can we know and how can we find out? Both photography and oral history assume that the subject carries a truth inside that can be made visible by documenting the body in the case of photography, or documenting the mind in the case of oral history. In both, the act of confession, whether voluntary or not, promises to extract this truth. In photography, the camera extracts a visual trace, and it presents this trace as evidence of who the person is, what they feel, or what they endured. In oral history, the interviewer elicits a narrative framed as testimony. In both, the subject is positioned to reveal themselves to an authority, a photographer or a historian. But this truth is a construction. The photograph frames, selects, and circulates a moment captured as representative of a person's truth. And oral history similarly frames, selects, and circulates a moment, albeit perhaps more complex in time of telling and told, as representative of a person's truth. In both cases, the end product, the photograph, the oral history, this end product is treated as knowledge, carrying the weight of authenticity. but it is a product of mediation, of framing, and of power. Both photography and oral history claim to unveil or reveal truth while simultaneously producing this truth. What we accept as evidence, the soldier's facial expression, the survivor's testimony, is always already shaped by the conditions of its extraction. So the extraction, the conditions of its extraction being photography and interviewing. So to view these questions from the perspective of confession turns our questions back onto us. In what ways do we participate in the construction and production of knowledge about the self of the other? In what ways are we entangled in centuries-long processes of confession in the West? It also confronts us with the ethics and moral conundrums of our research, of our conduct. Very simply, is it right to look at this photograph? Do we have a right to extract greater meaning from a human being's suffering? What confession do we seek from him? And what are we going to do with this confession so that we contribute to a greater good rather than just our own careers? There are also the epistemology, methodology, and ethics of the production of this visual confession. It seems unlikely that the photographer asked permission or consent from the soldiers he photographed. It is not a confession given freely or voluntarily. And we need to consider the ethics of making this image public in multiple ways. Now, at the time that it was taken during the First World War, the Canadian war photographers took photographs with a view to using them for war propaganda at home. Once an image is published, it circulates in public as a testimony on behalf of the soldier, almost like a freely given testimonial, but the soldier does not control its meaning, and neither does the photographer. The photograph's meaning can be changed simply by cropping it and giving it specific captions. So, as I noted, in a cropped version of this photograph titled "Shell Shocked Soldier," the confession is then turned into evidence for a specific cause. Now, since the taking of this photograph, the Geneva Convention of 1949, especially Article 13, has put some limits on what war photographers can show and what images can be published. Images of wounded and imprisoned soldiers are generally viewed as taboo, at least according to the Geneva Convention. So what then are the ethics of the Canadian archives to make this image publicly accessible? And what are the ethics of those cropping and using this image for various other purposes? So if we understand oral history also as a confessional practice, and I'm going to finish with this, we must ask several questions about our practices as oral historians. What are we actually constructing? What kind of self are we constructing in our pursuit of documenting and interpreting other people's lives? How are the meanings we construct around life stories and notions of the self shaped by broader cultural and social ideas about the self, about knowledge, science, and truth? What are the effects of this knowledge that we produce through oral history? How does this knowledge affect us and the interviewees and society at large? How conscious, aware, and reflective are we in regards to the social forces that shape our interpretations? From an ethical perspective, what right do we have to ask people for their stories? What right do we have to document, archive, and publish these stories? What greater good is served? To what degree do we, too, remain invisible as oral historians? How do we remain invisible just like the photographer? How do we as oral historians make ourselves invisible after the interview, and to what purpose? To what degree do our interviewees and we as interviewers lose control over the interpretation of their confession, their narrative, once it has been archived and published? To what degree can interviewees and interviewers contest other narratives imposed on their stories? At what point does confession become an act of truth-telling? And when is it an act of extraction that benefits others? In other words, how do we balance individual rights with the common good? So my short introduction hopefully demonstrates that thinking about the connection between oral history and confession has some analytic value. And so in the following, we do not have to dwell on this photograph or on photography in general. We can talk instead about questions and comments and ideas and critiques that you have. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much, Professor Freund, for a lecture that has been at once intellectually rigorous and deeply thought provoking. You have invited us to reflect critically on the very foundations of oral history, showing us that the practice of listening, recording, and narrating is never a simply recovery of the past, but always embedded within structure of power, expectation, and interpretation. By engaging with the idea of the confessing animal, you have illuminated how oral history carries within it both the potential for empowerment and the danger for reproducing dynamics of surveillance, authority, and control. What has been especially striking is the way you have drawn our attention to the complexities of voice and silence. That testimony is not only about what is spoken, but also about what resists being spoken. That memory is not only personal, but also profoundly shaped by cultural and political contexts. In asking us to examine the very conditions under which stories are told and heard, you have opened up urgent questions about ethics, responsibility, and the possibilities of truly dialogical history. Your lecture challenges us to reconsider our roles as scholars, listeners, and archivists. How do we avoid turning narrators into mere sources of data? How do we ensure that listening itself does not become another form of appropriation? And how might we imagine oral history as a practice that honors rather than constrains the dignity of those whose voices we engage? These questions lie at the heart of what we, at the Voices from Periphery, seek to do to create spaces where voices at the margins are not only recorded but truly heard, and where silence itself is treated with respect rather than as absence. We are deeply grateful for the clarity, humility, and care with which you have guided us through these difficult reflections. With your kind permission, Professor Freund, we would now like to open the floor to our audience reflection. We warmly invited your questions, responses, and thoughts, whether in the form of critique, reflection, or dialogue. May this session be not just an exchange, but a continuation of the spirit of listening and questioning that your lecture so powerfully embodied. Okay, so uh, can I ask the questions that are from our YouTube platform, sir, if you give us the permission? sir. Hello, sir. Am
Yes.
I given? Yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah.
can I ask those questions that are from our YouTube platform if you give us permission? So,
Yes. Yes. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Thank
Of
you so
course.
much, sir. Okay. So, okay, okay. So, the first question is from Ayush. Okay, my friend. He is asking that if, as you suggest, oral history risks transforming narrators into confessing animals within structures of power, how do we escape this paradox? Can oral history ever truly be emancipatory, or is it always already complicit in reproducing the very disciplinary mechanisms it seeks to resist?
Yeah, I think that really goes to the heart of the whole question. That's a great question. Um, I think I think reflection is at the root of all of this, at the basis of this, where we become aware of our own assumptions about what it is that we can accomplish and cannot accomplish. Um, I think we are caught up in this history of interviewing, of confessional practices, of thinking about what the self is, of ideas about how truth is constituted and what science plays in, what role science plays in all of that. And I think as long as we always take time to reflect on how we ourselves are embedded and entangled in the production of knowledge and truth, we can also then build that into our own practices and our own writing. And that has very specific, concrete steps. So, in terms of interviewing, I think it means that we go into interviews knowing that we can't capture everything, and also that we understand that however long an interview is, however extensive it is, even if it's a life story interview, that it is only a snapshot in a way, that we are aware of the different layers of time, that we understand that these are not just confessional practices, but also autobiographical practices, and that autobiographies shift over time. But it also means that we think, I think, as oral historians, more about what we do with interviews after the interview has been recorded, especially in terms of how it is archived and published. Because in my mind, when we archive an interview, it becomes something different. It becomes public, and we do lose that power over how it is interpreted. And that means that we, first of all, talk about this with our interviewees, that we, that they understand the implications of archiving an interview, and that we also maybe put more safeguards in place for regaining some of this control over interpretation, or at least regaining control over who gets to interpret, and for what purposes. So often, I think the practice is to just record interviews and then put them up online, or put them into archives for anyone to use. There are good examples, however, of oral history projects where that was much more strictly monitored, where oral historians and their narrators decided that whoever wanted to use those interviews needed to gain permission from the historians and the interviewees. rather than just putting up everything online and leaving it for people to use in whatever ways they want. So these are more concrete answers to this conundrum of being caught up in certain power structures and the loss of control, and also this myth of autonomous selves.
Okay, sir. So our next question is from Deepak. Okay, so he is asking that you have shown us that silence, repression, and refusal are as important as speech in oral history. But how do we as scholars ethically interpret silence without projecting our own meaning onto it? Is it possible to listen without translating absence into yet another form of presence that serves the historian's narratives? I also put the questions in our chat boxes. So,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Yes, so I have written about the ethics of silence elsewhere, and I do find silence very problematic. There are the silences in the interview, and then there are the silences off the record, so to speak, the silence that are happening outside of the interviews, but that are still part of the whole project. And I think to some degree we see ourselves often as being charged with making sense of detecting and making sense of those silences, and interpreting those silences, and in a way, creating stories about our interviewees that our interviewees have not shared, and almost putting ourselves in a position where we appear to know more about them than they do, almost like therapists or psychoanalysts. So there are silences, and we can see those silences. Sometimes it takes a little bit of work to see those silences, but what to do with them is an ethical problem, and it's not always easy to figure out what to do with them. I think it's important to, first of all, listen to what people actually do say, and to take that seriously, and then to think more about what it is that we want to achieve with our projects. Is it always necessary to sort of expose silences? And in a way, exposing those silences is a form of disrespect, right? There's a reason why people do not want to say certain things, why they do not want to talk about certain things, and perhaps that is something that we need to respect. That is on an individual basis, right? But then we also do oral histories to better understand social processes and group mentalities, like Luisa Passerini did in interwar fascist Italy, for example, and the silences after the Second World War. And think then I think we have a greater right to think about communal and group silences, and to think more about what implications they have for society. And that, I think, is when we move towards contributing to the greater good, where we better understand how society works and how silences in social groups work. But I often see too much psychoanalyzing in oral history, where there are all kinds of there's a lot of, I think, over the last 20 years or so, there has been an increase in sort of therapeutic language and terminology, that is not always illuminating, that seems to shut off discussion or insight rather than allow us to explore and understand at a deeper level. So where we, put ourselves, perhaps because we don't reflect enough about this, in the position of therapists diagnosing various forms of mental states that it's not really the role of oral historians.
Okay, sir. So the next question is from Rakhi. She is also our one of our founding member of this little group. So she's asking that in invoking Foucault's notion of confession, you highlight the disciplinary nature of testimony. But would one also argue that confession, when strategically mobilized by marginalized voices, becomes a form of counterpower, a way of reclaiming narrative authority within oppressive frameworks? How do we then distinguish between confession as subjugation and confession as resistance?
Hmm. Yes, yes, because when I critique oral history like that, and I've heard that before, people respond by saying, well, then we can't do oral history anymore. But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we think more about um, uh, what happens when we do oral history. It doesn't mean that we cannot do oral history. Um, there's often a tendency to highlight the emancipatory and liberating and empowering aspects of oral history as if that was built into the method, which it is not. The method is caught up in all kinds of histories of power that are problematic, and we participate in those whether we want to or not. The difference is, are we aware of this? Do we reflect on this? And do we think about what it is that we are trying to do? So to do oral histories, believing that we give people a voice or that we empower them simply through the act of interviewing, I think is not sufficient. Like, we have to think about the ways in which we participate in the construction of this narrative, the dialogue, the conversation that we do. And of course, oral historians have been doing this for half a century. So this is nothing new. It's just a constant reminder that we need to think about that creating narratives as counter narratives are important, but simply recording and publishing them is problematic. It's often not enough. And that is also true for what happens with these stories after the interview. What do we do? What are our ethical responsibilities for safeguarding these interviews afterwards? So these are things that I want the field to think about more, to think more about the responsibilities that we have outside of simply interviewing people and putting their stories into the public realm. So it is a difficult path towards finding this balance between understanding that we are caught up in relations of power and then also undermining those relations of power to turn our interviewee stories into counter narratives.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Next question is from my friend Arnav. Okay. So he is asking, oral history often claims to give voice to the voiceless. But is not there a danger that in attempting to represent others, historians risk speaking over them once again? How do we measure when oral history becomes an act of empowerment and when it slips into appropriation?
Yes, yeah, those are exactly the questions, right? So um, I think we are moving away from the idea that oral history gives a voice, because people do have a voice, um, and we are giving them a public forum. And that already shows the relationship of power, that they do not have access to this, that we are the ones in academia and universities that have access to certain public forums that other people do not. And so we need to think about what that means. And we need to then again think about exactly this question, like what are our goals and whose story are we actually telling? Is it our interviewee's story or is it our own story, using quotations from their interviews, for example? And that is a difficult question, and I think that is something that every oral historian needs to answer for themselves for each project. I don't think there are easy roads to this. I think empowerment has been overemphasized. I'm not sure that oral history has that much power to actually empower people. Um, at least not simply by doing oral history. I think it requires more than just interviewing people to empower them. Um, and and so this is something that one has to think about carefully when designing oral history projects. For example, how much are people involved in the lead up to project design? How much are they involved in the use of funding, for example? How much are they involved in coming up with the questions that are being asked? How much are they involved in deciding how the interviews will be published and archived? That is where these more difficult questions of empowerment come in. Simply interviewing people, putting their interviews, publishing their interviews, I don't think is a form of empowerment.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Uh, we have so many questions left in our chat box, but because of the time constraints, we only take one last question. So, may I proceed, sir?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, the last question is from Shanta. Oral history projects often rely on the trust of narrators, yet the very act of archiving their voices places them in institutions that may outlive their intentions. Can oral history ever truly guarantee that the voices it preserves will not be reinterpreted, misused, or even weaponized in the future?
Yes, as I had mentioned earlier, I think there are certain safeguards that we can put into place. So recording interviews and putting them up online for anyone to use, I think that is a problematic practice, because it is problematic already when we think about informed consent, because can we really understand and know where the internet is going, where online access is going? And artificial intelligence is just the latest stage in all of this, the latest challenge. So can we truly give consent to have something put up online? There are alternatives. For example, at the Oral History Center here at the University of Winnipeg, we usually only have basic information and maybe some excerpts online. And for full access to the interview, to the full interview, people have to apply, and they need to at least sign a number of forms to get access to the full interview and transcript. All of this is, when it comes down to it, a matter of trust, where we, all of these things are now, they are either made accessible in electronic form, or they can be easily made into electronic form. And so if we give access to other researchers, then it becomes more difficult to control how these researchers use and distribute and copy and so on. So there's a certain amount of trust in the researchers that we need to place. On the other hand, archiving of interviews and also of transcripts is absolutely necessary and important, because in the archive is the oral histories that sit as counter narratives to the voices of those in power. Because that is what archives usually do. They archive the voices of those in power. They are usually mandated to archive government records, to archive perhaps big companies' records. But they are usually not mandated to archive the voices of common folk, of people who are usually not in power. So oral histories serve in a really important purpose in archives, to sit as counter narratives. But when they are in archives, they become historical sources. And in 50 or 100 years, those sources will be used by historians for their own projects and purposes, and they will be interpreted in new ways. And so that means that perhaps certain safeguards need to be put in place that are similar to documents, government records, that are also usually not accessible for a certain time if they involve personal information. So we can't guarantee that voices will not be misused, misinterpreted, or even weaponized in the future, but we can put in a few safeguards to make sure that they cannot be, for example, harvested by insurance companies or AI companies for their own purposes, by simply not putting them up online.
Okay, so before we bring today's gathering to a close, I wish to extend, on behalf of Voices from the Periphery and everyone present here, our deepest gratitude to you, Professor Freund. Your presence with us today has been a true honor. Through your lecture, you have led us into the very heart of oral history's promises and its complications, reminding us that memory, testimony, and silence are never neutral, but always shaped by the power relations and expectations within which they unfold. You have shown us that oral history is not simply a method of recovering voices, but a space where listening itself must be examined with humility, responsibility, and care. The generosity with which you shared your insights has left us with much to reflect upon. The challenge of hearing what is spoken and unspoken, the danger of turning voices into confessions, and the urgent need to rethink what it means to witness ethically. These are not abstract concerns, they are real, and they deserve our attention. listeners, and fellow human beings. We live today not only enriched with knowledge, but also renewed with a deeper sense of responsibility to listen attentively without appropriation, to preserve without silencing, and to engage with voices from the peripheries in ways that honor their dignity. Your words have reminded us that the task of oral history is not only to remember the past but also to shape more ethical and inclusive futures. From the depths of our hearts, we thank you, Professor Freund, for guiding us through this difficult yet necessary reflection. Though this session comes to a close, we hope that the dialogue you have opened today will continue across our classrooms, our research, our communities, and our collective imaginations. With that, we'll bring this gathering to a close, carrying forward the inspiration and the responsibility that your lecture has placed upon us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much to the Voices from the Periphery and to Palab for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm very honored. And I also want to thank you for these very sophisticated questions. I wish we had more time to discuss more of them. I would have loved to hear more about these ideas of confession in your own cultures, because I'm quite sure that there are many different aspects there that I haven't considered at all. But maybe that's for another time. So I wish you all well in your future studies and keep up the great work with your Voices from the Periphery project.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.